Hello and welcome to the Business Education webinar. This is one of a series of webinars that we are producing, and this particular one is going to focus on the fire safety audit. If you've been contacted by a member of our protection team, then your premises may be due for a fire safety audit. And this webinar will give you an understanding of what you can expect from our officers and also what to do to assist with the process. So the aims of the webinar then, to give you an overview of the legislation, how it applies to your premises. We'll look at when and why a fire safety audit is carried out. Look at the audit process itself and how you can assist in making the process easy and less burdensome on you and your business. And what to expect from the fire safety officer, how we are going to approach the process and the work that we can do prior to the audit. We'll look at initial enforcement expectation, what we will determine after the initial audit, and we'll be able to let you know before we leave the premises. There'll be letters and notices, the formal letters and notices that can be issued after the visit and what you need to do after the inspection. And we'll also cover any appeals process if you want to dispute any enforcement action that's taken. So we'll look at the regulatory form fire safety order, to give it its full title, or the fire safety order, or FSO. Came in October 2006, and it brings all workplaces under the fire safety umbrella. And it repealed a number of pieces of legislation, and above all it is risk assessment based. And this applies to all premises apart from a single private domestic dwelling. So when the fire safety order was introduced, places like churches, hospitals, schools, where before they weren't really covered by fire safety legislation, these premises now fell within the scope of the fire safety order. So what to do then? As a responsible person, well, you need to do a fire risk assessment. Now, these have been a legal requirement since 1997 under the Workplace Fire Precautions legislation, but this was replaced by the fire safety order, and this is what brought in the element of relevant persons. So let's just have a look then at what a risk assessment should be. So it must be suitable and sufficient, and it must be carried out by a competent person. And the significant findings should be recorded, and it's good practice to record it, but it must be recorded if 5 or more employees are employed at one or more premises. Now, this is a common misunderstanding. So if Mrs. Miggins owns a pie shop with 1 employee, she has to do a risk assessment but doesn't need to record it. Now, Mrs. Miggins then opens another 4 pie shops with 1 employee in each. This is 5 shops with 5 employees across the organisation. So now each shop with 1 employee must have a recorded risk assessment for each premises, 5 or more employees. Or if there's a licence enforced in the premises, for those of you who know Shrewsbury, every year around September, October, just up from the fire station, there's a large shipping container placed on land next to QuickFit, and that sells fireworks, and there's 1 person employed in that premises. But they have an explosives licence issued by the local authority, so that fire risk assessment must be recorded. So the fire safety audit can be generated in different ways. Now, all fire and rescue services have what is known as a risk-based inspection program. Now, this is a database of all commercial, sort of non-domestic premises that look at the risk in the building, and this determines how often that premises is inspected. So, for example, any premises with a sleeping risk, your sort of hospitals, hotels, guest houses, they'll pose more of a risk to the occupants than a shop on the high street or a small factory. So any premises with a sleeping risk will be visited more often to ensure their fire safety arrangements are kept in order. Now, it could be following a complaint. As a fire authority, we have a policy to deal with fire safety complaints within 24 hours. Now, complaints can vary in seriousness, and our 24-hour policy may be that we initiate a phone call to the premises to ask some questions, or if it's deemed that the complaint may pose a more serious risk to life, then a visit to the premises will be undertaken. Now, naturally, any visit to a premises following a complaint will be unannounced. That way we can see if the complaint is justified or it's vexatious. Now, it's worth bearing in mind that the vast majority of complaints are unjustified because they come from people who don't really understand how your business is operating. but also it could come from disgruntled employees or neighbours. And one thing to remember is that yes, we are there to check that you're compliant with the fire safety order, but more so to help you with advice and assistance in dealing with any issues that we find. Now, if required, we can then generate a full fire safety audit at a later date. Now, if unfortunately you do have a fire, this could indicate that your existing fire risk assessment may be inadequate and you should carry out a reassessment. And a fire incident often provides an opportunity to review the efficiency of existing fire procedures and fire safety arrangements. Now, our protection team have a post-fire procedure, which is to contact the premises following a fire, initially by a phone call, unless there's a more serious risk to life. Now, that phone call will discuss the circumstances of the fire and any actions taken by you and your staff, and this conversation will determine if we need to carry out a full fire safety audit, or we're satisfied that you have the situation in hand and you've reviewed and, if required, amended all your processes and procedures. Now, fire and rescue services use what we call a relative risk matrix, which is a banding system. And what this means is, as part of the audit process, we collect information on the building, talk about the footprint, the height, the use, number of occupants, and that's given a score. And then we'll collect information on the management of the building. Sort of look at your fire risk assessment, your general fire precautions, staff training, any procedures, and that's also given a score. Now, both of these scores are added together to give an overall risk rating for that building, which will then determine the frequency of future inspections. So in reality, you may have a really old building with lots of issues, but if that building is well managed, then the relative risk is lower. On the other hand, you could have a brand new building with all the latest fire safety systems in place, but if the building is poorly managed, then the relative risk is higher. So another way to look at this would be to think about a well-managed hospital and a well-managed office. While the management score may be the same, the building score will be significantly different due to the size of the hospital and the occupants, the sleeping and immobile. So as we discussed, sleeping risk will always score higher on the overall risk matrix. So we'll look at the audit process. When we're looking at documentation, the inspecting officer will contact the responsible person prior to the inspection to agree a suitable date and time for the visit to take place. And then once agreed, a formal letter will be sent with the details of the visit and also what documentation will need to be available to view. Now, this will be things like the fire risk assessment. This is the main document that will demonstrate to the inspecting officer how you manage the fire safety arrangements in your premises. The fire emergency plan, this details what to do in the event of fire and forms the basis of your staff training. We'll look at testing and maintenance records, sort of weekly and monthly tests, plus any annual test certificates from competent engineers. And we'll look at when your records of staff training, when they received the training, and more importantly, what was the content of that training? What were they told during those training sessions? And we'll look at the general fire precautions. Now, this is going to be a walk around the premises to check that the information contained in the fire risk assessment is evidenced in the premises. So if your fire risk assessment says all exits are kept clear and unobstructed, is that the case in reality? And we'll see that as we walk around. What to expect then from a fire safety officer? Our officers will be punctual, and above all, our officers are professional fire safety officers. We're all trained to level 4 national diploma. Now, while we're there to ensure that you comply, we will offer appropriate advice where we can, and we will try and assist you with any solutions that we find. So as we are there, please take the opportunity to ask us questions. There's lots of businesses that we visit. They have ideas, but they just don't know how it will affect their fire safety arrangements. When we're doing the audit, you have a trained professional in front of you. Please pick their brains. We can't tell you what to do, but we can offer you an appropriate advice and to point you in the right direction. Now, if possible, you could provide any documentation that we discussed previously electronically before the visit. Now, this will save time on the day. Having to read through a 30-page fire risk assessment does take time, and if we only see it on the day, it can mean that we spend longer in your premises disrupting your day while we read it. Now, we have been doing a lot of this work virtually during the recent pandemic, and it is something that may be appropriate to use going forward. We view all the documentation electronically and then just visit the premises to walk around. Now, after the audit, we will provide some initial feedback on what we call our initial enforcement expectation. Now, this is based on the scoring of the management element of the audit that we discussed before. So, depending on the outcome of the fire safety audit, there's enforcement action has 5 levels, although bear in mind that the audit itself is just a snapshot in time. So broadly compliant, this generally means that everything's in order and compliant with the requirements of the fire safety order. And in this instance, no follow-up visit is required. Now, a notification of deficiencies would mean that there are some elements of the fire safety order that are not compliant within the premises, and we would write to you to outline these deficiencies and to give you an opportunity to rectify these issues. And in this instance, we'd probably arrange a follow-up visit within a few weeks. Now, most of the audits completed by our officers will fall within these 2 categories of enforcement action. However, there are others, which is an enforcement notice. Now, this would be where there are several significant and serious deficiencies, or where there would need to be a greater degree of enforcement action to ensure that the premises is compliant with the relevant articles of the fire safety order. Now, any failure to comply with any requirement of an enforcement notice is a criminal offence and carries a fine and up to 2 years in prison. There's also a prohibition notice. Now, that is a prohibition notice can be served on any premises where it's identified that the lack of general fire precautions would place anyone at risk of serious injury or death in case of fire. The prohibition notice can restrict the use of all or parts of the premises for certain activities or working practices. So, for example, a premises may be restricted from the use as a sleeping accommodation but could continue to operate as a business, or we could restrict the use of the premises as a business to allow sleeping to continue. Now, the prosecution, this can result in fines and imprisonment if the responsible person can be prosecuted under the fire safety law for committing any offence. For example, an offence is failing to comply with the requirements of an enforcement notice, failing to comply with the requirements of a prohibition notice, or failing to provide adequate general fire precautions where that failure places one or more relevant persons at risk of death or serious injury. So technically, if we have to issue a prohibition notice, then an offence has already been committed and the responsible person could be prosecuted. So if you do have an enforcement notice or prohibition notice served, these are legal documents under the fire safety order, and there is a right to appeal against these notices. So if you're a responsible person and you're issued one of these notices, you can appeal to a magistrate's court within 21 days of the issue of that notice. Now, a consequence of that appeal is that if the appeal is against an enforcement notice, then that enforcement notice will be suspended by the magistrate. However, if the appeal is against a prohibition notice, then that notice will remain in force due to the potential risk to life. Okay, so that's the end of this session. Just so that you're aware, we are making available some additional seminars that could be beneficial to you and could be more specific to your premises. We have the main business education webinar, and that's the start point for business education, and you may have already watched this. It's the longest webinar as it covers the whole of the process that you would want to follow as a responsible person. We've also got one on business continuity, looks at the risk from arson and some preventative measures to ensure your business will continue to grow and thrive. If your premises has a large and complex fire alarm system, then the unwanted fire signals briefly explains how to manage that system to reduce the nuisance alarms disrupting your business. And finally, remember, it is your responsibility as the responsible person to ensure that you are compliant with the fire safety order. Now, if you do have any questions, there is an email address there and a telephone number. If you ring up and ask for the duty fire safety officer, they will be able to assist you with any questions that you may have that are more specific to your premises. Thank you for watching.